And brothers and sisters, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce you to somebody who has been making it happen for working people for many, many years. As a young union official, he represented low-paid workers in our valuable public services. As an internationalist, he campaigned against apartheid and for world peace. And as the leader of the opposition, he's inspiring a new generation of activism. People who, like him, believe politics should be for the many and not the few. Please welcome to the stage, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, UNI Global, for the great honour of inviting me to speak here today. And can I bid every one of you from all over the world a very, very warm welcome to the wonderful city of Liverpool here today. And can I say, to follow that incredible performance is very difficult because everything was there. Hope, oppression, people fighting back, and then concluding with the wonderful words of Joe Hill. Can we say a huge thank you to everyone who put that performance together? The choir and all of the actors on stage who did it, and all of the union banners that came on stage to support right at the end. Because this city of Liverpool is a city of solidarity, is a city that has seen much in its past and has a great future ahead of it. But it's also a city of warmth and humour and compassion. And I get myself into trouble every time I say this, but it really is the music capital of Britain. And to demonstrate the sense of warmth and inclusion there is in Liverpool, before I came into this conference today, I went to see a game of football in Everton Park, and it was a game of football played by refugees and homeless people, supported by the local community and volunteers who are working with those communities, supporting them with food banks and solidarity. That is what brings communities together, to recognise our common humanity and what unites us. So I want to pay tribute to UNI Global, not just for the work you do every day in bringing people together, fighting to improve conditions for workers around the world, but also for hosting this fantastic Congress here in the city of Liverpool, a city whose history, absolute history, is rooted in the labour and trade union movement. You saw the pictures of Jack Jones and so many others on the banners that were paraded in front of us. Can I pay a particular and very warm tribute to Philip Jennings, UNI's first General Secretary, who was standing down after 18 years at the helm. The fact that there are over 500 unions represented here today from over 113 nations around the world is a credit to him, to the team, to that sense of unity of purpose, of internationalism, of UNI Global. Philip, thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for putting on today's event. I realise I've been going a bit fast with the interpreters. I'm really sorry. Sisters and brothers, the whole world relies on interpreters. Thank you for everything you do. And I'll go slower now. I've been a trade unionist all of my adult life. And as leader of the Labour Party, I know our existence is dependent on the strength of trade unions and organised labour. The British Labour Party is unique, at least amongst European socialist parties, in that our party didn't create its own trade unions or trade union confederations. It was the other way round. Our Labour Party was created by trade unionists with the aim of representing working people both in Parliament and in government, and it is this objective that is at the forefront of my mind as I speak to you here today. Last year, at a UN conference in Geneva, I laid out what I believe to be the 4 biggest challenges that we are facing as a planet. The threat to our climate from carbon emissions, the global plight of refugees forced to flee their homes due to war and poverty, and climate change, dangerous and counterproductive use of military force based on a bomb-first, think-later approach to international affairs. And lastly, absolutely staggering levels of global inequality and the continuing rise of a super-rich elite determined to do all it can to keep its ill-gotten wealth and power free from any democratic accountability. At this very moment, as we're here today in Liverpool, a quarter of the world's population are living in poverty. Let me say that again. A quarter of the world's population are living in poverty. 1 in 10, 10%, are literally on the brink of starvation. And just today, we've seen the absolutely tragic news that 6 million people are facing starvation in West Africa's Sahel region. Parents being forced to take their children out of school and foregoing essential medicine just to make sure they can buy food. That, of course, comes on top of the horrendous humanitarian crisis driven by a Saudi-led conflict the UK has assisted, advised and armed that is taking place in Yemen. We have to do much more to help stop these terrible humanitarian crises. And that means we have to do much more to drive and support multilateral processes. But instead of proposing and securing a United Nations Security Council resolution to bring about an end to the conflict in Yemen, the British government plays the disgraceful role of blocking such a motion. And instead of condemning the Israeli government's disgraceful killing of scores of unarmed Palestinian protesters in Gaza and supporting the action to protect Palestinian civilians, the UK government abstained. First in the UN Security Council and then in the General Assembly. Shame on them. These are crises, challenges and injustices which can only be solved by international cooperation, solidarity and collective action. And they are challenges which cannot be solved without the aid of the international trade union movement. Britain, as a country, is at a crossroads as we leave the European Union and chart a new course in international affairs. My party, the Labour Party, campaigned to stay in the European Union on a platform to remain and reform. But after the vote to leave the EU, we know that our job is not to block Brexit, but to ensure that whatever deal is negotiated between the UK and the European Union, it is shaped by Labour priorities and does not turn Britain into a deregulated corporate tax haven with low wages and limited rights. Instead, we put people's jobs, living standards, environmental protections and labour rights first. Respecting the results of the referendum does not make us any less internationalist, because progressive internationalism is about far more than signing up to supranational bodies or institutions. It's about recognising that the great problems of our age, inequality, war, refugees and climate destruction, are common to everybody and will never and can never be solved by individual nation-states alone. Some in our Conservative government dream of something called Empire 2.0, i.e. another empire. But Labour's vision, our vision, instead is one of solidarity and social justice for working people right across the globe. And as the sixth richest nation on earth, there is no denying that we do have specific responsibilities which go hand in hand with the relative prosperity of this country. That's why the next Labour government in Britain will be committed to ensuring respect for human rights, workers' rights, and environmental sustainability in the operations of British businesses all around the world. Central to this will be closing down tax loopholes used by British companies who are avoiding paying tax in Britain and elsewhere, depriving countries of essential revenue for their public services. It also means tightening the rules governing corporate accountability of abuses in global supply chains and requiring companies operating in Britain to report on the totality of their supply chains. We must stop companies which may operate within the rules in the global north, ignoring their responsibilities in the global south. Companies, large and small, can trade around the world, but that does not mean they can trade morality for greed. For too long, multinational corporations and banks have been left to write the rules and rig the system for themselves. Unrestrained corporate power increasingly threatens the ability of states to protect fundamental human rights and ensure people can, for example, have access to that basic human need of safe water, that basic human need of somewhere to live, and that basic, obviously very basic need of enough food on which to survive. That is why Labour is also the first member of the Party of European Socialists to oppose the dystopian investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms embedded in trade deals around the world, which allow big business to sue states in an almost parallel justice system. Cases brought by corporations against states have threatened progressive legislation of all types across the world, whether for public health, environmental protection, or for public ownership of public services, to name just a few. These excesses of corporate power are why Labour wholeheartedly supports the United Nations Human Rights Council in its determination to create the first legally binding treaty to regulate transnational corporations under international human rights law. It is the elites of the industrialized countries of the global north who stand behind our rigged economic system, and increasingly it is elites around the world that benefit from and sustain it. A Labour government in Britain will ensure that any new trade agreements we sign not only do not undermine these labour, environmental and consumer standards as well, but bolster and support them. And we will end export finance support to companies involved in any bribery or corruption. Restricting abuse is not a restriction on anybody's freedom or liberty. It's about opening up democratic opportunities for individuals and communities to live richer lives, to have control over their working and home lives. If we accept that to act as a restraint on unaccountable power, as well as representatives of the people, nation-states must be run along democratic lines, with regular elections, respect for human rights, freedom of speech and assembly. Then it surely follows that the economic sphere, including multinational corporations, in many cases more powerful than nation-states, should also operate along more democratic lines. Global and international unions are central to achieving this necessary end. But as employment takes on new forms, we must be able to collectively respond in how we organise. New technology is not something to be opposed, but harnessed, not for private wealth accumulation, but for collective good. The capacity of these technologies to liberate people from excessive work is often being overlooked, as they're instead used to disrupt lives, replacing people's jobs through automation and leaving people out of work entirely, or driving down security and working conditions through the informal, what we call gig economy and platform economies. Workers subject to these informal working arrangements are often excluded from national labour laws and regularly denied access to collective bargaining or union representation. Our plan to tackle this in Britain is to ensure that all workers get full rights from day one and to end bogus self-employment, whereby companies such as Uber have shirked their responsibilities to their employees. These are changes which we want to make in government, of course. The important thing for trade unionists to remember is that they do not have to wait for the right government to come along. This may seem like an odd thing for me to say, somebody who's trying to be Prime Minister. But it's always important, very important, to remember that the truly democratic and revolutionary changes in history were never handed down from politicians or leaders. They were fought for by people organising together. There will be individual stories from the histories of every single one of our over 100 countries that are here today about the campaigns and battles that ordinary people went through to enjoy many of the rights that we enjoy today, the sacrifices they made by people organising in their communities and workplaces to demand change for the many, not the few. That's why trade unions have such huge potential for change across the globe. And it is why unions are so often attacked. In Britain, these attacks are mostly limited to smear and misrepresentation in the media, restrictive legislation and corporate blacklisting. But in many countries, brave trade unionists face violent and often deadly repression by both states and corporate-linked paramilitaries. It's a time-honoured union saying that an injury to one is an injury to all. And that's just as true in the international context as in the one nation or one workplace. It is why conferences such as this are so important, so that we can work together across national borders, because what happens to workers in one country, of course, affects what happens to workers in another country. If wages and conditions are driven down on one side of a border, it's easier for employers to drive down wages and conditions on the other side too. It's why it is vital for unions to keep an internationalist outlook, fighting against and not succumbing to attempts to divide workforces and communities and scapegoat migrant workers. In Britain, for example, Unite the Union has done fantastic work in organising both British and migrant workers at Sports Direct, Britain's largest sports retailer, and have highlighted that it's not the migrant workforce, but unscrupulous employers who are trying to drive down wages and damage conditions. And in Bangladesh, we've seen the power of workers coming together in the ongoing courageous fight for justice led by Bangladeshi garment workers, many of whom are women, in coordination with trade unions and civil society groups in this country and globally. There is a tradition within the labour movement of such action, from the gains made in the 1920s in New York in newly organised workers from Eastern Europe to the work of South African trade unionists in organising and using the power of Zimbabwean and Zambian miners in the fight against apartheid. And what comes to mind is what the great Cesar Chavez said when he was organising agricultural workers in California. He said, "It's not about the lettuce and the grapes, it's about the people and their hopes and their opportunities and their livelihoods." We must always remember that migrant workers are workers. If we allow ourselves to be divided, we are all weaker. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. It is an important time for all of us to remember and commemorate the 18 million who died in that conflict from all across the globe. But it's also a poignant reminder of how we as trade unionists can prevent further war and further slaughter in the future. We must never forget that although the international socialist parties repeatedly agreed before 1914 to oppose war and slaughter, it would inevitably entail, but this was quickly abandoned by the vast majority as soon as a mood of jingoism and xenophobia swept over all the countries of Europe in the lead up to the war. It's a lesson for us all about the dangers of listening to the siren voices of reactionary nationalism. They're present in every country across the globe and are on the rise in far too many countries. When the global economic system is so clearly only working for the few in both the global north and the global south, more and more people will seek alternatives. It must be our job as a labour movement to ensure that our socialist, our collectivist values are that alternative for working people right across the globe. We must continually push for solutions that prioritise people over profit. Because if we do not seize this opportunity, if we fail to present a coherent and radical vision of how people's lives can be improved through democracy, equality, and peace, then it will be the destructive forces of exclusivist nationalism and division that win out instead. We must avoid echoing the voices who would have us building walls and have us descend into damaging trade wars that destroy jobs and livelihoods, divide our common interests into rival nationalities. We're all very well aware of the impact of President Trump's election in the US on the back of a campaign dominated by Islamophobia and anti-Mexican rhetoric. In much of Europe, too, the organised far right is on the march, while right-wing nationalist parties make headway in parts of Asia and also in Latin America. Their rise is caused by the failure of neoliberal economics to cater for people's everyday needs. As wealth inequality rises, people are searching for answers as to why, despite doing exactly what the system asks them to do, that is, spend most of their waking hours at work, they still find themselves unable to escape poverty. Even in the richest countries in the world, like Britain, we have young people with good jobs who still can't afford decent quality housing, and National Health Service nurses forced to resort to food banks in order to survive. Trade unions have a central role in tackling inequality and injustice, and in delivering material and social gains to working people of all races, all religions, all ethnicities and genders. Indeed, unions have played a central role and will continue to play a central role in achieving equality for women all across the globe. It was 50 years ago this year that the women machinists at the Ford plant, the Ford car plant here in Liverpool, went on strike to support other women strikers in London who were demanding the same pay as their male colleagues. It was a fantastic act of solidarity by some amazing working-class women, which led to equal pay in law between men and women in Britain. They gave us that step forward. We face huge obstacles today, but we're sustained. We're sustained by the power of our unity, both in our own trade unions and in the unity of confederations like UNI Global. We may work in different sectors, in different countries, but we're together, one in our fight for human rights, for equality, and for social justice. And we take inspiration from those who went before us. We stand on the shoulders of giants. You heard Joe Hill, you saw the banners of those great people that did so much before. They stood up to abuse, to threats, to violence. And we stand in solidarity with those facing that same repression today in too many parts of the world. Our movement is strong because we stand together as one. For the many, not the few. Solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and it's always a pleasure to share a platform with you. And watch out, because I think my kids are going to chase you for a selfie.